So, quick explanation. I made this audio back in 2022, but there's been a lot of issues with burnouts. My editor during the time also ran the burnout as well. And eventually I just pivoted to other content. But tonight I went back and watched other videos, and then I remembered that I did have a script ready for Zero, and I went ahead and looked at the script, and then I listened to the audio that I made for Zero that was already complete. And I was very moved by all the words I said. So I felt that this video had to be made. That said, I do not have any more video footage of Mega Man X on my computer. I did a reformat and that's all gone. And I felt that wasn't necessary anymore because I wasn't making any more X videos anyway. But now that I feel this drive to have this audio come out so that you all can hear it, I went ahead and did the next best thing. And I just went ahead and did a podcast format for this video. So a lot of this will just be me talking and there will just be a backdrop. So you can just go ahead and treat this as a podcast. So just sit back, relax, and have a listen. Regardless, this is probably going to be the last video I'll ever make on this channel. I'm just involved in other things now, but I really felt like this Zero video had to be made. Thanks for watching and I appreciate it.
I have a confession to make. I was originally going to make a character analysis on Zero. The time was just right. After all, this is a lore channel that focuses on the writing and story of Mega Man games, with specific focus on the X series. Zero is the most popular character in the series, and considering I just got done with the character analysis for X, he had to be next. No question about it. So I played through the games for the next 100th time, read countless development interviews, wrote my notes, and started writing my first draft. But as I got to page 10 and exactly 5,313 words, I realized I couldn't do it. I couldn't provide the same level of raw love and passion for that analysis that I could with the X analysis. I had to take a long time to figure out why that was the case. And I first thought it was because I just didn't like Zero. So I wrote my new script with that in mind. But then as I wrote to page 10 and exactly 5,717 words, I realized it wasn't that either. Yeah, I like Zero, and I was pretty happy about that. But there's this knot of frustration in my gut whenever I see Zero be praised by other people, and I couldn't quite figure out why. So as I sat in my chair and critically thought about what it was, I thought about all the moments when I felt that churning in my gut, and there are just so many small moments that made me feel that way. That's when I realized it was everything. The bad writing, the actions of Inafune Capcom Inti creates, and the choices that were made, and the shortcuts that were used to get there. Make no mistake, I am absolutely saying Zero's story in both the X series and the Zero series are full of flaws. But I think this is mostly ignored by the community as a whole. Overall, I haven't been able to vent my frustrations on these topics. And for Zero in particular, it's widely unpopular to do so. There's so much misinformation through game journalists and fan theories gone wild that the ones who have ventured into criticizing Zero and his story ultimately end up getting drowned out. Well, no more. I won't be holding anything back here. If no one is going to set the record straight, it might as well be me. So here it is, the harshest Zero character and story analysis there will ever be on the internet. But at the end, I'm going to tell you how, despite all of that, Zero prevailed through it all and is still a solid character. We can't start the story without talking about the man behind the machine, Keiji Inafune. This artist is a creator of Zero. For realsies this time. Now, most of you already know this part of the story, but this is also a good opportunity to clear up a misconception. There's an excerpt behind Did You Know Gaming that spread like wildfire within the fanbase, and now has played the community into harping this misinformation. Set the record straight, this comes straight from Inafune himself in the Mega Man X Complete Works. Within the entry of Mega Man X1, it states, the nature of a creator is to constantly want to make something new, something different. However, we did understand that we couldn't completely go against everything that came before it. Usually I would be the one doing the main characters, and Koji would take care of the sub characters. This time, however, we decided to change things up a bit. I asked Koji to do Mega Man, and I made the sub character, Zero, my project. I'm sure I said this in many places and more than a few different ways, but I really wanted Zero to be a playable character. I wanted to offer a different Mega Man, and possibly a more hardcore game. I wanted to make the character's personality a little more hardcore too. And I knew if I was working from the design of a traditional Mega Man, I'd be stuck in the whole nice guy image. The whole time I was designing Zero, I was seeing him as the new Mega Man. But I didn't bring that up when I went to submit our designs to my boss. I brought out the X that Koji designed and said, "Here's the new Mega Man." My boss had a very positive reaction to X. And when I brought out the design for Zero, I simply said, "And this is a sub character." I figured that would ensure a less critical analysis of Zero, and as a result, I got an immediate okay in the form of, "Red, huh? Hmm, yeah, that's nice." To summarize this long-winded quote, Inafune never intended Zero to be the main protagonist of the X series. He wanted Zero to be important and playable, but X was created from the very beginning as a more familiar protagonist to fans and newcomers alike. This narrative that Capcom shut down Inafune's plan to have Zero as the main protagonist is completely unfounded, and frankly, it needs to stop. Inafune understood that Zero wouldn't fit as the main protagonist as he was too radical of a change in both design and personality. Instead, he understood that Zero would fit better as a supporting character, because in that role he can enact his plan to experiment with the dark world of Mega Man X. Now, I know typically on this channel we bash Nothing quite a bit. Don't worry, this will be the only time we'll defend him. What's important to note though is Zero is made to be part of the hardcore world of Mega Man X, while X himself is more of a fish out of water. Through X, we're supposed to learn of the hardships and the dangers. Our mentor and helper, Zero, is already acclimated to all these things. This is why in the first entry, Mega Man X, Zero is our benchmark for the entire game. By design, you as a player are supposed to want to be as powerful and confident as he is. And by the end of the game, you do just that. But what many don't realize is this hook has to work in order for you as a player to be invested in the story and the world. So what made Zero in X1 so appealing that we want to be like him? Well, the honest truth here is Zero is a product of his time, while X is a product of the 80s, where the hero always won against the villain in a bright and inconsequential world. Zero is a product of the 90s, where action heroes were slowly becoming much edgier and more grounded world. Granted, edgy in this case meant wearing dark trench coats, walking away from explosions, or doing catchy one-liners. And yes, Japan went through this shift in edgier and darker tones during this time as well. Animes like Akira and Dragon Ball Z were influencing creators within the entertainment industry as a whole. And it cannot be understated just how influential this shift was. Sega literally marketed itself as the edgier console and Nintendo as the kiddie console and won that console war based on that alone. In other words, Inafune's vision of Zero just happened to also follow the trend in the 90s. He looked tall, strong, confident, and most of all, he knew way more about what was going on than you did. It also helped that X got his ass handed to him by Vile to clearly signal to the player, "Hey, this isn't your typical kids game. You worthless piece of shit." Everything in that intro stage was designed to set up the player instantly liking Zero. He helped you, he is your friend, and most of all, even when X's only line in dialogue is, "Man, I suck," he cheers you up, puts your ass in gear, and wants you to become as powerful as he is. That pep talk is everything. Imagine if Zero just said X when I bye. It would be far weaker of a hook and fail to have you as a player feel connected to Zero. And that connection is extremely necessary when Zero dies to give you a fighting chance to defeat Vile, and eventually Sigma. Zero as a supporting character is honestly masterful. I don't know a single person who dislikes Zero's role in X1, and it's Zero in that game that provides you with the knowledge and understanding of the cool world of the X series going forward. So, what if I told you Zero was supposed to stay dead after X1? Yeah, that's right. Zero wasn't supposed to be revived after X1. He would have been remembered as a noble sacrifice, and X would carry on to defeat Mavericks and Sigma continuously. There was one man, though, who changed the course of the X series forever. We all know who it is. Going back to the Mega Man X Complete works. In the X2 entry, Vice President of NT Creates Yoshihisa Suda stated, Zero died in X1, but Inafune just came in one day saying, don't you think it would be a shame to let Zero stay dead? So we brought him back to life. It was that simple. Now, I believe the whole story isn't stated here, considering there's a character relationship document made way back even before X1 released, stating the relationship between Dr. Wily and Zero very clearly. Nevertheless, Inafune very much had plans for Zero within the series, and he pretty much had free reign to do so. After all, Zero wasn't locked behind the pesky mandates and expectations that X is, so Zero effectively became the driving force of the plot from this point forward. X was served to be the viewpoint character, while Zero basically had everything interesting happen to him. But they had to get there first. After all, Zero was dead. So how would he come back? Well, he just rebuilt by not Wily. Easy enough. But his role from X1 also couldn't be repeated. The story makes it incredibly clear that X was tearing Mavericks apart on his own. He couldn't be your mentor anymore, and he's not necessarily your benchmark either. So he can only really serve as one purpose to X and especially the player, your friend. So in X2, the plot wants you to save Zero. If you have the context of X1, that's about all the motivation you need to do so. Now, I personally think if you don't have the context of X1, X3 introduces Zero to you a lot better. Because you see his giant health bar, tall stature, his giant green boobs, his three-hit combo, and save X all with a rocking hero track. Then you learn you can call him in to help you in a pinch. Granted, you're not in a boss room anyway. Now, Zero was supposed to be fully playable in X3, but thanks to outsourcing and development hell, we had to settle with a limited playable character instead. But honestly, as a narrative, this may have worked even better. Zero as a guy who jumps in and lets X take a break lets the player know there's a strong partnership between the two. But Zero also trusts that X is fully capable of handling himself. It becomes pretty apparent that X is meant to quickly outgrow Zero, in both his durability and arsenal of weapons and functions. Even so, granted you don't kill Zero off, he saves X at the end of the game, and they both run off into the sunset. So it's at this point I need to confess to you and say I did not play X1 first. I played X3 first, and then went backwards to X1. I think this is one of the worst things here about the story across the entire series. Inafune and his team had a clear narrative with Zero in mind, but what they failed to do is provide context to each game and either expect the fans to have played the first game or just didn't care and decided to make them stand alone. Now, yes, this is a video game, and this is the 90s. Mega Man X is probably the first time a AAA platformer has ever tried to write an overarching narrative across multiple games. So I will give them some slack on that. But there are absolutely some story beats that just do not have the strong impact that it should if you don't start with X1. And the majority of them stems with Zero's death. If you already know he's going to live, the impact of him dying is minimized greatly. And considering the majority of the reason why Zero makes such an impact to players across the world is because of his actions in X1. Now, I hear what you're saying. Just start with X1, idiot. That's like playing The Last of Us Part 2 without playing Part 1 first. But it's not. Tell me, should you play Super Mario Bros. Before you play Super Mario Bros. 2? Should you play Sonic Adventure 1 before playing Sonic Adventure 2? Should you play Ocarina of Time before you play Twilight Princess? Should you play Resident Evil 1 before playing Resident Evil 2? In all these examples, the latter games are self contained stories that hold up on their own merits. If you ignore Zero entirely, the X series mostly does this as well. Despite X2 being a direct sequel to X1, they provide enough dialogue to give you at least a good idea that X has done some cool stuff in the past and has its enemies on the back foot. You won't really feel like you're missing something insanely important just because you skipped X1. And X3 is the same way, even with Zero in mind. There's seriously no reason to go back to play X1 other than that it's really good and to learn more about Zero. Otherwise, the X series as a whole is pretty episodic, which hurts Zero overarching storyline more than it helps. And X4 doesn't fix this. Mega Man X4 will be a major shakeup for the series. For the first time, Zero will be fully playable and have a full scenario all to himself. It should also be noted that X4 would signal the departure of the X series from Nintendo consoles, and onto the first of a new line of consoles from Sony, the PlayStation. This is actually a much bigger deal than one would first think, because this opens a new whole community of players, especially ones in a teen demographic, to the world of Mega Man X. But this also had the adverse effect of closing their doors to players who delegate themselves to Nintendo consoles, like me. This means Mega Man X4 served as a new entry point to the series. People who will be new to the series had to be introduced to both X and Zero as characters, without any prior knowledge from the Super Nintendo games. While this will mostly fail with X, it worked wonders for Zero. Going back to the complete works, the X4 entry has Inafune stating this. For X4, I really focused my attention on my responsibilities as a producer. I left the game design up to Sasaki and the others who had done such a great job at X1 and X2. Though I did make sure to tell them not to mess with Zero. I didn't draw any illustrations for X4, but I did involve myself in the story making side of things. My degree of involvement was probably only slightly less than that of X1. So if Inafune involved himself in the story, but only to a degree, it's pretty obvious where that influence showed. Back when I played this game for the first time ever, I first watched the game's opening, and when I finished watching it, I thought, man, that is a lot of focus on Zero. Zero's campaign in X4 is pretty heavy, featuring a rival and a love interest. On top of that, we've had many anime cutscenes, and is an active player in the story that triggered multiple tragedies while recontextualizing the X series by revealing that he was Dr. White's creation with the intent of destroying X. By comparison, X story only really provides context to X4's scenario, and X himself simply serves as a viewpoint character to understand why everything happened as it did. With X and Zero strangely not interacting with each other in their own campaigns, it really feels like the scenario was built almost entirely for Zero. That said, Zero's campaign was much more of a mixed bag for me. Since I was playing this in 2011, I was exposed to plenty of good and solid voice acting. So the cringe voice acting, while amusing, ultimately was a negative for me. I wanted to take the story seriously and I couldn't. The other issue was I couldn't really get behind the relationship that Zero had with Colonel and Iris. On the surface, the story is pretty straightforward. Rebel Force is framed for the deaths of many humans. Zero tells Colonel to turn himself in. Colonel refuses and runs away. Zero roams around fighting Mavericks and then kills Colonel. Iris in her grief fights Zero, then Zero kills Iris. Zero goes through an insane emotional breakdown and in his rage fights General. Then once he realizes the true culprit is Sigma, he fights him. During this, he learns about his true origins as a Maverick. After that, he grieves for Iris and begins to wonder if he is able to truly save anyone, or if he's destined to just be a Maverick. Now, when I summarize a story like this, there shouldn't be any problem. But like with everything in the story, the devil is in the details, and those details aren't exactly there. Simply put, Colonel and Iris seem just thrown in to die. It was clear Zero cared about these two, but they really needed more screen time before everything went to hell. As mentioned before, Iris is the love interest and Colonel is the rival. But who are they really? This is the first major problem of this campaign. While their roles in the story are serviceable, their impact in Zero's story is stunted because we have no idea who they are. We have the game's opening, which shows that Zero, Iris, and Colonel are pretty chill with each other, but that's it. We know nothing of their backstories. Some people may point to Extreme 2 as a reference, but Extreme 2 came out 4 years after Mega Man X4, and Iris was placed in that game more out of pity than anything else. But what about the manual? Well, aside from the US version being inaccurate, like usual, this doesn't really tell you anything either. So, seriously, who in the hell are Iris and Colonel? Why should we care? How can we be invested in Zero's journey if the game fails to connect the player to these characters? Because the plot tells you to? This makes everything fall apart. Iris' death is supposed to be a game changer for Zero, but without any attachment towards Iris and by proxy Colonel, it makes the moments fall flat. If we compare this to X1, sure, we didn't exactly know what was up with Zero and his origins, but we didn't need to either. In the context of the narrative, Zero was an active helper at the beginning of our journey. He was our friend, our mentor, and most importantly, our benchmark. Even with his dying breath, Zero is still evaluating you. If you didn't get the arm parts, Zero will believe you don't have the firepower to beat Sigma and will give you his buster. If you do have the arm parts, Zero go, yeah, you got this, buddy, and then dies. Going back to X4, there's no moment like this because you, as a player, are not an active part of this narrative. Colonel never speaks to you or your actions. He speaks to Zero. Iris never speaks to you or your actions. She speaks to Zero. This leads into the second major problem. You are not experiencing the story of X4. You are watching the story of X4. Zero is not your avatar. Not like how X was in X1, anyways. Zero is his own character, and while you just so happen to be controlling his movements, the choices made in the plot are not your choices. Many players would actually disagree with Zero's choices made during its campaign, especially when we have a girl telling us to not kill her brother. It's this disconnect that really hurts the payoff and consequence of Zero's story, because at least to me, I didn't feel sad when Iris died. Since my thoughts were full of, well, this feels really contrived and easily avoidable, apparently Capcom felt similar grievances, because they made a clear effort to flesh this out in supplemental material. Most importantly, the Japanese only Rockman X4 X and Zero strategy guide, which goes over the origin of Colonel and Iris. This is important for context, so I'll lay this out. Scientists were attempting to make the ultimate Reploid with the same level of free will and emotion as X. Obviously, they failed, as they could not replicate X's strong fighting spirit combined with his love for peace. Therefore, they separated the Reploid into two separate parts. Colonel, representing the fighting heart of honor, and Iris, representing the heart that yearns for peace. Despite being separated, Colonel and Iris shared more than 50% of the original data, making them literal biological data siblings, and this irrevocably linked them together on an empathic level. Despite this being tucked away in a strategy guide, this is canon to the lore. In fact, Mega Man X Dive would use his origin story as a basis to a what if scenario where the combination of Iris and Colonel were successful. This also answers why Colonel did not surrender when asked to, because it would have literally gone against his programming, as Colonel represents fierce fighting spirit. Iris, representing pacifism, now has a context as to why she's never done anything except yell at Zero and Colonel to stop fighting until she mentally broke upon feeling Colonel's death. This makes Zero's campaign easier to digest, though it still ends up being rather silly. More importantly, though, this context helps understand why Zero is so close to Iris and Colonel. They're, quite literally, two different personifications of X. Again, scientists try to replicate X's personality in order to harness the phenomenon that is his unlimited potential. So Iris and Colonel had to emulate X's heart and soul. This means the reason why Zero opened himself up to these siblings is because they reminded him of his best and only friend. While this is compelling stuff on the surface, I can't help but wonder if Capcom understood that they pair Zero with the female aspect of X. On top of that, Iris is clearly in love with Zero, and her death causes an emotional breakdown and an irrevocable change of Zero's character. Frankly, the implications are hilarious. Before we move on, there's one more thing I want to highlight about Iris. We're going to talk about that scene. No, I'm not going to show the original version, because as legendary hilarious that dumpster fire of a cutscene is, it's so bad that it ruins the intent behind it, and the hamminess isn't present at all in the Japanese version. Instead, I'm going to play a redubbed version made by Lucas Gilbertson, who would go on to voice Zero later in official games and multiple fan works. In this scene, Iris tells Zero that she wanted a world where only red boys exist. It's important to note that as a representation of X's heart, this is a pure contradiction to X as a character. But what's important here isn't that Iris wanted a red boy only utopia, but rather she felt this was the only way she and Zero could live in peace. This gives a very large implication that Iris believes humans are a negative influence on the world. This doesn't exactly work because humanity as a whole never makes a real appearance in this series. In fact, X4 would be the beginning of a major flaw in the X series where it keeps putting humanity in a bad light, but fails to add context to their actions since they never show up, ever. But if we ignore that and just focus on the scene in a vacuum, this yet again opposes X's viewpoint. While X wants humans and replicants to exist in harmony, Iris wants nothing to do with humans at all. This doesn't mean she wants to kill all humans like Sigma, she just wants to be independent of them. It should then be more telling that Zero outright denies Iris's dream, telling her that it's just a fantasy. Zero says it as the girl is dying and she's pouring her heart out, so this is something he firmly believes in. Now, this doesn't mean he signs off on X's dream. In fact, Zero has an emotional breakdown because he realized he has no idea what he truly wants. He's always been about finishing the mission and destroying the enemy in front of him. And the only real desire he ever showed is helping X save the world. So Zero screaming to the heavens asking why he fights is a very real question he has. He has no idea why he exists or why he was made. He doesn't even understand himself as a person. He can easily kill his friends with no hesitation, and that ends up scarring him on a deep and psychological level. Iris's death is a character defining moment for Zero, and it will plague him for many future entries. We also need to talk about Zero's reveal as what is creation. X2 spoiled this part really badly, but the reveal in and of itself is well told if you're using a translation patch. It puts all the emotional resonance on the reveal that Zero was originally a maverick that nearly killed good guy Sigma. This adds implications to why Zero clearly didn't try hard enough to peacefully resolve things, as he could very well be geared towards evil tendencies. We, as a player, do not want this by virtue of us knowing that Zero fights for the good of the world, and this feeling is more potent if the player has the context of X1 to X3. But this leads to the personal problem I have with this reveal. It heavily contradicts the Zero and the SNES trilogy, who seemed very confident in himself and knew where he stood as a person. In X2, Sigma did the same thing, saying that Zero should be on his side. And Zero is like, yeah, sure, but you really smell and I don't like you. And that was the end of it. No internal conflict whatsoever. Even when you had to fight him in X2, Zero eventually regains his memories and is like, yeah, my bad, bro. And all is well. Again, no internal conflict. So now Sigma does it again in X4, and Zero's like, wow, I am a monster. This also gets into the potential argument that Zero as a whole was pretty out of character in X4 compared to the SNES trilogy, as Zero is much more stable, and most importantly, had strong moments that showed he cared about things other than finishing the mission. There's a decent argument that the Zero from X3 would actually have a conversation with Iris about whether Colonel could be saved. In short, X4 felt more like a soft reboot, and Zero's personality was shifted some in order to be edgier. So I won't beat around the bush here. X5's plot is very messy. Despite Zero being the focal point of this scenario, the game kinda dicks around for the first half trying to haphazardly set itself up. Continuity is a pretty huge problem here, and due to the nature of the game and perhaps the series in general, the plot doesn't want to slow down to investigate Zero's internal conflicts now that he has them. Instead, the game pretty much focuses on how much of an asshole he is. A lot of Mavericks respect X while outright calling Zero a cold psychopath. I guess they also played X4. Credits to where it's due, though. X5 does reference past games. One of the bosses, Spiral Pegasus, who is part of the remnant army of Reploforce, respects X enough to trust him with the fate of the world, while he has a burning grudge with Zero for killing Colonel. Basically confirms that Zero killed Colonel while X fought the Journal, so take that as you will. The most interesting part is Zero realizing that the Sigma virus is making him stronger, which is pretty weird to be figuring out now, since the virus has been running rampant since X3. But this either goes nowhere in the good ending, or somewhere in the bad ending. Either way, Zero can kill X, even when he is ultra amped up in the bad ending and becomes Awakened Zero. Instead, he saves him and dedicates himself to protecting him. After all, Sigma's entire plan from X2 to X5 is to force Zero to awaken to his true self in order to kill X. In the bad ending, he just dies right after saving X. But in the good ending, Zero goes after Sigma with full expectancy that he'll die. Either way, he does sacrifice himself, and his dying wish is for X to live on. Zero's story as a whole is about defying fate, and being more than the product of one design. Being a creation of Dr. Wily, he chose the opposite of what his father yearned for, and protected the son of his greatest enemy. Wily is known for having imperfections in his design, which is why he always had to base or copy robot designs from Dr. Light. Zero, in fact, was based off the designs of Blues and Base, with Blues being Light's first attempt ever at a sentient robot, and Base being a literal copy of Rock's design, just with his self determinism removed. With Zero having the same issues as Base, which is extremely rebellious and borderline psychotic, Wily needed a way to control Zero. Through this, he made the Maverick virus. Now, according to the design document, Wily failed to complete the virus before passing away. What this was supposed to do is reprogram Zero's personality to be subservient to Wily's orders. Through the bad ending of X5, we see what Zero is supposed to be under Wily's will. He specifically states that being awakened feels amazing and has full understanding of what he was meant for. But even through that, the Zero that we know and spend time with ultimately comes through, and his desire to protect X outdoes any of that. His trust and compassion for X shows what truly matters to him, and it breaks whatever hold there is on his programming. Despite the rocky start, the climax of Zero's story is well told. If Zero killing Iris is a prelude for things to come, Zero sacrificing himself for X is him coming to terms with his past and choosing the future. Zero's character journey in X5 is really strong and is a great way to end this character. Of course, his character wouldn't end here, though. In fact, thanks to undying ambitions and a desire to milk the cash cow, Zero would not be allowed to die peacefully. For this next section, I'll need to talk about the behind the scenes on where Zero is going next. This part is going to be pretty long, but the foundation has to be set here because at this point, there's so much infighting to have control of Zero and his popularity that it causes disastrous results. To those who already know where this is going, just bear with me. I promise you this will be worth it. So, it's pretty common knowledge at this point that Enoughnate wanted Mega Man X series to end at X5. I'm going to say this right away that this doesn't really mean much. While we can all agree that Enoughnate spearheaded the idea of Mega Man X as a series, it'd be wrong to say he's the end all be all. There's an entire corporate team above him that were calling the shots, and an entire hardworking creative team below him that put the work and sweat into making the games what they are. I'm not saying Inafune didn't do anything creatively. He was the artist after all, and he had a whole team creating what he wanted. I'm just saying the X series, and Mega Man in general, is far more than just one man. And even when Inafune had everything working on his vision, he often left them to their own devices. In fact, if there was anything related to X himself, he probably had nothing to do with it, and the creative team had to fill in that gap themselves. And I've already provided evidence of Inafune saying he only heavily worked with the storyboarding of X1 and X4. And to cap it off, in the complete works, Inafune said this in his entry of X5. I have very little to do with X5. I just told the team to finish off this series with this title and left it at that. So even in the finale of the X series, Inafune had little to no input regarding it. I bring this up because even after all these years, there's still this narrative that Capcom ripped the X series away from Inafune, and that's just not true. The X series belongs to Capcom, which Inafune was a part of. It was a team effort. It's important to realize that we only know one side of this story. We don't know if the team who worked on X1 and X5 strongly opposed the series ending on a whim. And to say the X series should have ended just because Inafune said so would be a slap on the face to everyone involved. To anyone in the year of 2022 continuing to having this mindset, I implore you to go watch our read interview of the Mega Man 11 producer Kazuhiro and how he reminisces of the time that he and the team worked on Mega Man 7. It's stories like his that do not get heard from the people who worked on the X series. With this, I feel you will completely understand where I'm coming from. Link of the video and the written format will be in the description. Ultimately, Inafune wanted to drop the X series in order to have Zero become the main character. This is the point where he couldn't hold back his love and bias for the character he created. Ironically, he's just as much of a fanboy of Zero as Dr. Wily is. That said, I'm not going to lie to you and say Capcom was virtuous in this. Again, we don't know why Capcom greenlit X6. Though, if I had to make a guess based on research, it's because the Mega Man X series was, at the time, the most popular series in the Mega Man franchise, and it was doing very well. Despite what people within the fan base would tell you otherwise, X5 was very well received critically and did extremely well in sales. In terms of business, ending the X series would have been a terrible financial move, especially once you consider the Mega Man Zero series would not be made by Capcom themselves, since Anofne commissioned the IP to integrate. Granted, this company worked very closely with Capcom, but they were still an independent company that Capcom had no real control over. They really didn't have any idea how the game would turn out, and with Anofne failing to act as middleman between Integrate and Capcom,
It actually should not be a wonder why X6 was greenlit.
and there's no question that Capcom would have been in for a big surprise if they didn't. Now, this is well known at this point thanks to Mega Man Zero Complete Works, but there was an earlier published interview by USgamer.net back in 2015 called Companions Through Life and Death, the story of Integrate and Mega Man. Through that interview with Integrate's president, Takuya Aizu, he states, the main concept that we wanted to explore was Zero killing X. We wanted to come up with something really sensational. There was something about Mega Man Zero at first we felt wasn't quite right. It wasn't true to our idea of the character. So we tried to resolve that by coming up with this dramatic concept. Also, there's this manga series called Kikaider that really influenced me. And Nafune happened to like the concept too. The Kikaider manga had this anime spin-off called Hakaider. There, the bad guy Hakaider becomes the main character and defeats the main character of Kikaider. That struck me as really sensational and stuck in my mind. And that's what inspired me to take the direction we did with Mega Man Zero. Originally, Anofne had simply requested a game built around Zero and X, but I wanted to do something with more impact. So that's why I came up with this idea. Within the team, there was no resistance at all. In fact, right up until we went to master the game, the plot played out with Zero defeating X. However, Capcom as a company, it didn't serve well for the company to have a series in which X is the hero, and then another title where that same hero gets killed off. And so, because of that, at the very, very, very end, like right before we set the game to be manufactured, we had to change it so that the X that Zero kills was actually a copy. We didn't have time to change the gameplay though, so just the story was changed slightly. So, looking at this from a certain angle, there's the idea that Capcom swooped in to stop this Zero killing X narrative. This is what multiple websites decided to go with, stating Capcom meddled with Integrated game. But this is 100% false. Again, this interview was in 2015. By this time, Body Number 9 was dragging itself to the finish line, and Intertrace was making the sequel to Azure Striker Gunvolt. The Mega Man Zero Complete Works was published in 2017, but the interview that was published within that book was made 1 year after Mega Man Zero 4 was released. So, 2006. At this point, Intertrace was just releasing Mega Man ZX. Within that book, as you stated, to be honest, we were totally out of control. We weren't even listening to Capcom's thoughts and opinions. We had just decided to create the game based on the world that Suda created. We then took our ideas to Nafune. Character designer Taro Nakayama followed this up, stating, and Nafune asked us to carry over as much of Zero from the X series as we could, so that it was clearly Zero from the Mega Man series. We did our best to please Nafune, but we couldn't just create the same Zero as the one from the X series. It was important that the public would be able to visually tell the series apart right away. So our efforts were mostly concentrated on how different we could make him, rather than how similar we could make him. In short, Capcom had no idea what Inti-Creates were doing, and Inti-Creates ignored their calls. I guess Aizu kind of forgot he had an interview where he outright admitted he gave no fucks. And this kills the narrative that multiple gaming news outlets have shelled out. The more important thing here is nothing failed to be the middleman to keep all the information flowing between the two parties. This is shown easily in an interview with Play magazine in 2004, where Inafune stated, I was originally planning on ending the series around X4 to X5. I really expected that to be the ending, and I was so happy. Okay, done with X5. That series is now closed off. Now let's start Zero. I'm really excited to start the Zero series. Here's Zero, he's kind of dead, and you power him up and he comes back to life, right? My mind, in X5, Zero died. And so I always planned to make Zero come back to life in the Zero series. But then X6 comes out sooner from another division, and Zero comes back to life in that. And I'm like, what's this? Now my story for Zero doesn't make sense. Zero hasn't brought back to life 2 times. What's even more interesting is even though X5 was meant to be the end of the series for Inafune, there's a piece of concept art that was made back in 2000. This concept art details Zero being sealed away after learning he was the carrier of the Maverick virus. To note, this was made by a Capcom employee, not an Into Creates employee. So the idea of Zero sealing himself away to stop the Maverick virus was in the minds of Capcom well before Mega Man Zero or even X6. Now, officially speaking, there's no evidence whatsoever that Capcom was going to proceed with this plan. But there's all the evidence in the world that Inafune wanted X5 to be in the series. So I've built up a theory of the scenario that happened as to why there's such a massive breakdown of communication. Let me stress this is extremely speculatory, and I am likely wrong about this. But it honestly has to be something along these lines for everything to make sense. So to start, Inafune tells the development team that X5 is the end of the series, and then runs off to make Mega Man Zero. The higher ups at Capcom contacts Inafune and asks him to continue the X series. Inafune says, nah. The higher ups then decide to get someone else in charge with X6 instead, and they pull in the team that worked on X5 to do it. The X5 team then decides to proceed with what they were initially going to do. At the same time, Inafune commissions Into Creates to make a Mega Man game. Into Creates provides a concept, and Inafune says, sure, you can make one, as long as you make it about Zero. Into Creates agrees to this. Inafune lets Capcom know that Into Creates is making a new Mega Man game. Capcom goes, oh, okay, what's it about? Answers, it's a new game about Zero. Capcom would then get very squinty-eyed at Inafune and say, okay, carry on. Capcom would then try to communicate with Into Creates, but as President Iger stated in their interview, they ignored Capcom. So Capcom decided to move forward with X6. As Into Creates were in the process of making the game, Mega Man X6 springs up and everyone has a collective, oh sh. After playing the game, Creates realizes that since the X series is continuing, they hastily changed their plans to make it so Zero doesn't kill the original X. In an ironic twist, X6's reception is very negative, while Zero One's is very positive. This is likely why X6 was so heavily ignored from that point forward. That last point is pretty well verified for X7, as Kitabayama made a point in a GameSpire interview to say that the studio was actively ignoring X6, nullifying its impact on the story. Of course, knew about X6 not being received as well as we wanted. We did think about that, but that wasn't the key. The key was that we needed to make a better, a newer, a fresher Mega Man X game, and we wanted to make it 3D. That's where a lot of our effort was, making a 3D Mega Man X game that worked. Not so much trying to correct mistakes from the past or dodge problems that occurred with X6, but more working on getting 3D right. In short, Capcom had given up on that point and pushing to your story that they cultivated with X6 and left it with Into Creates. Now, all of this explanation is to say this extreme lack of communication is pretty much the reason why we have essentially two versions of Zero running around at the same time, and they were very independent of each other. So let's start with the X series version of Zero, resuming where we left off with X6. I have no idea why he's here. I played this for the first time as X and wandered into the boss room with Nightmare Zero. I was confused by how easily I ran into him. Nightmare Zero felt more like Sigma Fortress material, but here he was out in the open, and the reward you get from beating him is Zero himself. Just like that. So the obvious question is, how is Zero not dead? And Zero just says the funny line, and that was all the explanation we were getting. Of course, there's more to it than that. Zero's conversation with Dr. Light indicates that he told a fib and just straight up doesn't know how he survived. Dr. Light doesn't know either. Man, I totally wonder if the writers will reveal the mystery behind this in the future installments and not just drop it like a hot potato. Zero's revival severely ruined what was otherwise a really strong ending for him in X5. And for what reason? Zero as a whole is pretty removed from the main scenario. No one really seems freaked out that he's alive either. Seriously, go play the game and read the scripts and compare them with the scenes to X. Like always, be sure to check out a translation patch. X and Zero scenes go down almost the exact same way. And the times they don't is because Isaac or Gate actually react to Zero being there. Isaac, who is totally not Wily, is the number one Zero fanboy, who gets a massive hard on when Zero beats High Max, while Asa gets really shocked and angry when X does it. When Gate reveals himself to the Maverick Hunters, he and X actually have a conversation that carries on to after the defeat of Nightmare Mother about the ideal world. In Zero's scenario, Gate's conversation is with Alia, and he criticizes her for relying on someone who was a danger to all Red Boys. And Zero's response to this is basically, "Stop using my DNA to be a dick," which was something X was already saying. Also, doesn't it seem weird that Gate is using Zero's DNA core when Zero himself is still alive? To be fair though, this mess does lead to Zero concluding that he actually is a menace to the world and seals himself away in his own ending. But then X7 happened, and I'm left with the same question. Why are you here? And since it's X7, somehow Zero is even worse in this game. Now, to be fair, out of everyone involved, he's the best part about this game. But in this case, that's basically on the same level as Luigi winning by doing absolutely nothing. Zero gets out of this with the least damage, but that's mainly because he's severely underutilized. He has literally nothing to do with X7's plot and has no importance whatsoever.
He's just there for Axel to bounce off of because X is too busy trying to counsel people on Twitter.
On top of that, he goes from cold and distant to straight up motionless. Like, holy shit, how do you even get Zero wrong? And then you had Zero's ending with a premonition of Mega Man Zero. So it has about the same level of impact as it generally does in X7. None. Then there's Command Mission. Okay, so Zero is pretty harmless in Command Mission, but he's unintentionally hilarious at the start of Chapter 6. Okay, like, bruh, why you mad? You're calling them the dregs of Giga City? Maybe you can make a surface level impression on Marino and Spider, but you're calling Massimo, Cinnamon, Nana, Chief R, and Dr. Galdeal the most untrustworthy people in the city? And is he also unintentionally lumping the Axel into that? Like, I know Command Mission likes pretending your party members aren't there when they actually are, but they just risk their lives saving your ass, Zero. It feels more like Zero is just mad that X actually has friends now. Not gonna lie, this is pretty out of character for Zero, but it's pretty harmless too. Command Mission was the first attempt at properly injecting Zero into the storyline instead of having him just there. I think for what it does, it's okay, but his temper tantrum certainly felt more like a distraction from the main plot elements. I don't hate his inclusion in Command Mission, but I felt pretty indifferent to him. In X8, okay, so I like Zero in X8. While he's not really important to the story, it was pretty clear Production Studio 1 had a better understanding of him and was able to make him a big contributor to the narrative regardless. A lot of this is because they spent a lot of time making sure the three main protagonists actually felt like an organic team with a strong dynamic. X is the hero, Zero is the muscle, and Axel is the young hotshot. Zero's dialogue with the Mavericks is also pretty damn good. Overall, there's a lot of hidden layers that are expressed in Zero and X8, and his vulnerabilities are expanded upon thanks to an actually good and well utilized supporting cast. It also helps that the ending perfectly portrays why Zero, despite not being important to the story, is important regardless, because he's X's best friend, and serves as a guiding light whenever X feels even a little bit lost. This is a wonderful line that encapsulates Zero's personality. Very well done. Also, the snare writers did a blink and you'll miss it moment when they explain why Zero isn't sealed up. According to X, the issue with Zero being a virus carrier is already resolved. How? Don't know. But take that as you will. X8 does take a long time trying to resolve long-standing continuity errors that X6 and X7 left. Though it can also be argued this is them signing off the Zero series as an alternate timeline to nip that snagging in the bud. Zero in Maverick Hunter X is pretty muted compared to his original self in Mega Man X. The Deus Sigma movie helps with that, movie showing the bond between X and Zero pretty early on. But compared to X, Sigma, and Vile, it feels like Zero got shafted and is strictly side character material. Zero's only real standout moment is when he sacrifices himself, which serves the same purpose as it does in the original. Don't get me wrong though, Zero is definitely important to the story this time, and there's nothing wrong with his character. But in the original, it's safe to say Zero hyper carried that narrative. So when literally everyone gets a massive upgrade in personality and especially screen time, there's just a natural loss that has to occur. So that's it. That's all the games in the X series. While I say and do stand by the fact that Inafune isn't the writer that people think he is, it's pretty clear that his lack of notes or even thoughts from X6 onwards left a harsh impact on Zero's story. From a creator standpoint, it might have been better to continue the X series without Zero, and just have Inafune do whatever he wanted with his character within he creates. But from a business perspective, Zero's popularity within the X series was too strong, and he was already established as a secondary protagonist. There's no doubt in my mind that removing Zero from X6 onwards would have displeased a lot of fans, regardless of the Zero series. However, I started this by saying I would be completely honest with you guys, and I'm going to continue that by saying Capcom should not have revived Zero. Yes, screw Inafune, but most of the creative direction for Zero has been from him and his notes. If he wanted to make a game with Zero as a true protagonist, and Zero has proven to be a breakout character, I don't see a reason why Zero couldn't have been given his solo career. Other than that, Capcom wanted a backup plan in case Zero 1 flopped. But the problem with that line of thinking is Zero was already dead. So they didn't need to bring Zero back so immediately and haphazardly with no explanation. They actually could have waited and checked the reception of Zero 1 before finalizing their decision. Because the fact is, Zero just has nothing to offer the X series ever since X6, and it's so painfully obvious. One can even argue that Zero is just a walking advertisement for the Zero series with how little importance he has to the plot. There's also another angle of look at this as well. Remember when X had this? Remember when X had armors and powers enhancing this? If you don't remember, that's fine, because X7 and onwards made it a point to no longer have X and Zero overlap with abilities. So X expanding his moveset with a Z-Saber could no longer be a thing, despite this being a heavily character-driven motivation, as it was in honor of Zero's memory. Now, I'm not saying if Zero wasn't in X6, X's Saber gameplay would be way better. There's a lot wrong with X's Saber, and I would attribute that more to the lack of time rather than Zero's inevitable inclusion. But what we could have had was an X that had built a foundation of Saber gameplay and brought a mixture of Buster and Saber abilities that would have been quite similar to the Zero in the Zero series, who is also capable of learning abilities for both Buster and Saber. A missed opportunity, in my opinion. This also goes further into X7. This will be talked about at great lengths when I make a video about Axel, but Axel himself has a pretty hard time getting in screen time without stealing someone else's. This is also the case for his inclusion in Command Mission as well, where Axel has the same issue as Zero does in X7, where he just shows up and then has nothing else to contribute to the game's narrative. X8 is the only time they get this balance between the main protagonists correct. But there still stems a problem where even though X and Axel strongly contribute to the game's narrative, Zero just doesn't have anything going on. In fact, X8 drones on about how Zero used to be important to the series narrative. Even Sigma was like, yeah, that virus you gave me is pretty cool, huh? I can't help but feel that the series narrative would have been much stronger if our trio wasn't fighting each other for the main spotlight. Because everything from X6 and onwards has the issue where scenario writers are desperately trying to find ways for our playable characters to exist with similar importance. And the game's narrative gets damaged because of it. The right answer, in hindsight, would be to remove Zero from the equation entirely. But I don't want that either. I want Zero to remain in the X series. I know I'm contradicting myself because I just got done saying the X series as a narrative, and maybe also from a gameplay perspective, could be drastically better if Inafune got his wish and had Zero running around in his own series, and X had free reign on his own. I truly do believe that's what they should have gone with. But there's something about Zero that makes me believe this would be the worst case scenario. And for me to get into why, I have to get into the Zero series, and why Inti creates his vision for Zero as a character completely missed the mark and was a horrible interpretation. To start, let's talk about cataclysm theory. For those that do not know, cataclysm theory is a theoretical explanation of the time gap between the classic era and the X era. This is the longest standing theory ever for the X series, going as far back as Mega Man X4. The idea is Wily activated Zero and killed off the original robot cast, explaining why they are no longer present by the time the X series rolls around. Over time, multiple variations of the theory were created, such as maybe Zero was Rock's final boss instead of everyone's final boss. At the very least, Cataclysm theory relies on Rock losing and perhaps dying to Zero. Now, I did not bring this up to talk about whether Cataclysm theory has merit or not. Plenty of people have already done that. What I want to bring up is Anophanes' response to this when it was brought to his attention. In 2008, within a Q&A on the Catcom community, it was asked if Zero killed Rock and Company. Anophanes stated, "No, Zero did not kill them. According to the way I created him, Zero is not such a person. It's not in his profile." Now, there is an obvious death of the author fallacy that can be applied here. If you don't know about that term, go look it up. It's in direct opposition to Word of God. But again, I'm not here to argue about the validity of Cataclysm theory. I'm here to argue about the sheer and baffling hypocrisy in Anophanes' words. If it's not in his profile to kill Rock in the cast, how is it suddenly in his profile to kill the one person he has ever loved, trusted, and sacrificed everything for twice? Why would you suddenly agree to integrate's idea to character assassinate X in order to justify Zero killing his best friend? Why do you think it was a good idea for integrate to take the character you love and spent years building up to just throw away all of his development in order to have this high sensationalism and shocking story of X going insane and Zero killing his own character through killing X? I know it was a while ago, but remember when Aizu or Suda or whoever read a manga where the villain became the protagonist and kills off the previous main character? That was their primary influence as to why they wanted Zero killing X. There's just one tiny problem with that. Zero is not a villain. Look, I know Infinity had practically nothing to do with X5, but if he agreed to that, I have my doubts that he even played the game. If he did, he would notice that even when Zero had his true memories and realized his purpose, he rejected it because he loved his best friend that much. The trust, the compassion, and the memories that those two spent together prevailed even at his worst. You're going to tell me that the original intent of Mega Man Zero was to try to convince me that none of that mattered? Does anyone realize the amount of setup that would have needed to happen in order for that to have a snowball's chance in hell? Setup that wouldn't have existed? Okay, so Aizu stated that they were only able to slightly alter the story. So let's assume in the original vision, Ciel was just a normal girl. Cyber Elf X doesn't exist, since the original X didn't seal us up away, and X is ruling over Neo Arcada with the four Guardians. The biggest justification that we have for Zero killing X over all other options is he has amnesia. I hope everyone sees how this whole narrative falls apart right away.
Oh, but light years, I hear you cry out. There's that ending in X4 where X says if he ever turns Maverick, Zero needs to kill him.
Ah, yes, this age old argument that disregards the fact that Zero responded by saying, "Don't say stupid shit." Outright ignoring the implications of his immense pain and sadness that Zero would feel to kill his best friend. Well, first, that is a Capcom idea, not an Inti Creates idea. Remember when I said Anophanes' partial involvement in X4 really shows? Yeah, Anophanes had nothing to do with X's side of the story. That was someone else's. But even if you want to say Inti Creates played X4 and fleshed out their idea based on that, that'd be ignoring the fact that they gave Zero amnesia to make him not remember anything about the X series, including X himself. Hell, even in the version that we got, Zero was pretty gung-ho about killing X and only started remembering things about the original X after he kicked in Copy X's shit. That means it's easy to deduce that in the original, Zero wouldn't have remembered anything about X until maybe after he was already dead. So like I said in the X analysis, there is a massive difference between foreshadowing and setup, and there is no setup. This is so mind-numbingly forced that Zero has to be a near blank slate for him to not question it. There is no rhyme or reason behind his premise other than a crazy desire to twist Zero's character into something he's not. And for some really insane reason, Inafune agreed to it. I was pretty upset when I explained how this was really stupid for X, but when it comes to Zero, I just have no words. There's nothing I can say that can fully comprehend the emotions I feel at this haphazard and careless attempt at taking the most popular character in the X series and outright committing character assassination through amnesia. This is why Zero One is the worst version of Zero ever, because he's not even Zero in this game. For reference, Zero doesn't even hold a conversation in this game unless it deals with CL trying to explain that X is a copy, or with Copy X himself. That stands to reason that in the original, Zero had literally no personality. He barely even has a personality in the version that we got, and that all stems from the ending. And in that ending, we see who Zero truly is, which is exactly the Zero that we knew from X5, the one who unconditionally trusts X with his life. This is the version that we got, and that's all because Inti creates getting cold feet and doing an extremely quick rewrite of the plot. And I guarantee you, this would not have happened if Capcom did not come out with Mega Man X6 first. And I 1000% guarantee you that if the original version came out, Capcom would immediately write it off as non-canon and would have yanked the IP back from Inti Creates and closed off any communication. That means no Zero 2, no Zero 3, and no Zero 4. Now, I can tell you how in Zero 2, Zero only shows sign of a strong personality whenever X is involved, and the shock and anger in Zero's face when X's body is destroyed. I can tell you how in Zero 3, Zero starts to see the Resistance as a home, and gains friends, and begins to respect one of his greatest nemesis, Harpuya. I can even tell you how Zero stores a lot of internal conflict about himself, and he needs people like X and CL to affirm to him that it doesn't matter that his body is fake. It's his heart that is real, and that's what truly matters. And even when he knows that, he can't help but feel happy that he was told that. I could even tell you the highlight reel of Zero's greatest quotes in Zero 4. There's the legendary one that everyone always quotes. And that one is definitely awesome. But there's one quote that he says to Crab that sticks with me more because it provides context, and it sets up for his legendary line to wheel at the end. We're only Reploids designed for war. It's not our place to change the world. As Reploids, we can only lend strength to those we trust. I made a promise to a friend I intend to keep, to someone who believed harmony between humans and Reploids was possible. I trust that friend, and I trust the humans that friend trusts. I could go into how that will define Zero as a character, and go into so much more, but if you've been paying attention, you will already know that I don't need to, because this Zero already exists in the X series. Despite all the drama, all the infighting, all the negligence of Zero past X6, and Capcom demanding that NT Creates makes a Zero 4 despite them not wanting to, resulting in them literally killing Zero off in defiance, it was actually the Zero of the X series that prevailed in the end. The Zero of the Zero series grows to be exactly the same as the Zero of the X series. Even with the dark story, the amnesia, the lack of personality, and the intent to frame him as a villain, Inti Creates knew that their dramatic concept of Zero was not true to the character. You can't change who Zero is, and you can't change how important he is to the series as a whole. The fact is, Zero doesn't need plot significance. He doesn't even need to be the protagonist, because what is truly important is his brotherly bond with his best friend. X's story is Zero's story. X's troubles is Zero's troubles. As long as X keeps moving forward, Zero will be right beside him, making sure he doesn't take a wrong path. He has never cared about justice. He never recalled ever calling himself a hero. He has only ever fought for the people he believes in. He won't hesitate. If an enemy appears in front of him, he will destroy it. That is why, despite it all, Zero is a damn good character.